So once again, my travels this time have brought me to Luxembourg, visiting my friend David here, who is on the camera. So today, the 9th of June 2022, which also happens to be Heroes Day in my country, Uganda. I am standing at the Prime Minister's office, and also at the statue of the Grand Duchess Charlotte, who lived between 1919 and 1964. This is a country that is only just over 2,500 square kilometers big. It also has a population of just over 630,000 people, but is statistically the richest country in the world by the statistic of GDP purchasing power parity per capita, which the World Bank puts at about just over $140,000, and which actually means, by interpretation, the stat is such that if you consider the total value of all the goods and services produced in this country on an annual basis, and you standardize them at the dollar value in the US, its purchasing power in the US, so that it is standardized across all countries. It's ranked number one ahead of countries like Switzerland, Ireland, and the US. It also is reputed to be one of the greenest countries with a high forest cover, obviously high standard of living and high quality of life. So I found it pertinent to talk about an idea I have been thinking of for some time, and this idea is around the realization that if you consider that since the late 1950s and early 1960s, when most of our countries on the continent in Africa got independence, with that benefit of more than 50 years of hindsight now, we haven't necessarily realized our full potential in many, many ways. And one of the things that I think has hindered that realization of full potential is the fact that the world's modern politics has been anchored on the basis of common interest. And because of the whole idea of country and nation being sovereign, those common interests have been also based on common country, and that has meant that the developing world and the developed world have been moving in silos, and so one of the new things I would like to experiment in a practical manner is a philosophy I would like to call the philosophy of interdependence, and even more better called sustainable interdependence. And what this actually means at the macro level is that the two categories of countries, developed and developing, leverage the best of what they each have. For example, the developed world would leverage what things like abundant and affordable capital, things like modern technology, things like years of standardization that helps in business and trade, things like certification. And then the developing world would leverage things that are best for them, and these are things like our youthful population that's energetic and vibrant, things like affordable labor, things like fertile soils, things like good climate, especially on the African continent, And so once you have these two things that are merged at the macro level, that would spur the realization of full potential of these economies on both sides. And at the micro level, this macro philosophy would be further anchored by a micro philosophy I would like to call two worlds, two homes. And what that would mean is that individuals like myself and my friend David here on the camera would in essence have a life of two worlds, where I have a home in Uganda and a home in Europe, or Luxembourg specifically. David has a home in Luxembourg and a home back in Uganda. And the concept of home would have many variations. It could mean a physical home, it could mean a business home or a business interest. It could mean that maybe like my child is going to school on the continent here in Europe. But in essence, it means that I have an actual life interest that is off my continent and on another continent, and David also has an actual life interest on the African continent, and which therefore would mean that what would be currently a country interest or a limitation to a country interest for David with an interest in Luxembourg and me with an interest in Uganda alone, that interest base increases and interlinks in a way that I have an interest both in Africa and Europe, and David has an interest both in Europe and Africa, and that ultimately means that the risk of country bias, continent prejudice is severely reduced, where the world being a global village is actually realized in a practical, scalable and sustainable manner, and that the risk of conflict and the risk of exclusion, for instance, the recent debacle where countries in the developed world sucked up all the available COVID vaccines at the height of the pandemic before the developing world could get a hold of them, just because the current dynamic or global order is such that the common interests are based on country and their borders. Those kinds of practices and risks would be severely mitigated and ultimately erased, and you would have a nice and much more healthier and practical and sustainable global village in which any human being on any continent is better able to realize his potential, both as an individual, as a community, as a country, as a continent, and as a race, more than we could do so now without this philosophy in practice. Thank you.